Chapter 8. Greek Influence and the Maccabean Revolt. History of Israel, the Temple in Shadow. The sound of bronze clashing against stone echoed through the narrow streets of Jerusalem. It was not the rattle of a battle, at least not yet, but the ceremonial march of foreign soldiers, their polished cuirasses gleaming like shards of the sun. The people stepped aside as they passed, staring in a mixture of awe and resentment. Up ahead, the sacred courts of the temple lay under a strange new banner. Blue and white pennants, marked with the thunderbolt of Zeus, flapped where the golden trumpets once caught the wind. The altar smelled not only of the familiar tang of burnt lamb, but also of something alien. A pungent aroma of roasted pig, its fat sizzling over flames that were never meant for it. A group of older priests, their linen robes streaked with dust, stood at the edge of the courtyard. They did not speak. They simply watched as a Greek official lifted a libation bowl high, offering wine not to the god of Abraham, but to Olympian Zeus. For the first time in living memory, the temple of Jerusalem rang with the hymns of another people, in a tongue that spoke not of covenant, but of conquest. Somewhere in the hills beyond the city, men were sharpening blades, whispering oaths, and vowing that this humiliation would be washed away, with blood, if necessary. But before the revolt could blaze, the roots of this moment reached back to the march of a young Macedonian king who had dreamed of uniting the world. The arrival of Alexander the Great. When Alexander III of Macedon, barely in his 20s, rode into the Levant in 332 BCE, the world trembled in a way it had not since the days of Nebuchadnezzar. His army moved like a storm, phalanxes of spearmen in unbreakable squares, cavalry whose speed turned battles into routs, siege engineers who could tear down walls thought to be eternal. By the time his banners appeared in the distance, Judea had already heard the stories. Cities that resisted him were reduced to rubble. Those that submitted often found themselves favored and enriched. The high priests of Jerusalem weighed their options carefully. A delegation, robes immaculate, descended from the city to meet the young conqueror. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing centuries later, claimed that Alexander approached the temple not as a plunderer, but as a man in awe. In the story, he bowed to the high priest, saying that in a dream he had seen this very man before setting out on his campaign. Whether legend or fact, the result was that Judea surrendered without resistance, and was spared the fate of Tyre, whose ruins still smoked when Alexander's horse trod the stones of Jerusalem. Alexander left no occupying army in Judea. His genius was not in immediate subjugation, but in planting seeds. Greek garrisons settled in nearby cities. Greek coins, stamped with the image of Heracles, began to circulate in the markets. And perhaps most transformative of all, the Greek language, the coin, began to seep into trade, administration, and eventually even scripture. The slow flood of Hellenism, after Alexander's sudden death in 323 BCE, his vast empire fractured among his generals, the Diadochi. Judea fell into the tug-of-war between two powers, the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt and the Seleucid dynasty in Syria. Under the Ptolemies, 301 to 200 BCE, the Jewish people enjoyed relative autonomy. Greek influence came not through the sword, but through commerce, art, and architecture. By day, Jerusalem's main street was a marketplace of sounds and colors. Jewish merchants bargained over sacks of barley, while Greek traders shouted the prices of amphorae filled with olive oil. Perfume sellers filled the air with the smell of myrrh. Money changers' scales clicked as silver drachmas changed hands. Children darted between stalls, their laughter mingling with the neigh of pack animals. On the western edge of the city, wealthy Jewish families began sending their sons to gymnasia, not merely to train the body, but to learn rhetoric, philosophy, and the epics of Homer. There, boys wrestled on polished sand, discussed the nature of virtue with Greek instructors, and debated in a language foreign to their fathers' prayers. For some, this was intoxicating. The Greek vision of the human form, the symmetry of their temples, the rationalism of their philosophers, all felt like an irresistible wave of modernity. The Torah, ancient and unyielding, seemed to them provincial, an anchor in an age of swift ships. For others, it was a slow erosion of the covenant. The gymnasium's emphasis on athletic nudity clashed with the laws of modesty. The philosophical schools debated gods in the plural. The theater celebrated myths that blurred the line between the divine and the immoral. It was here, in this cultural friction, that the seeds of future conflict took root. The Seleucid grip tightens. In 200 BCE, Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire wrested Judea from Ptolemaic control. At first, his rule was pragmatic. He lowered taxes, respected the temple, and confirmed Jewish law. But the Seleucid court, a fusion of Persian pomp and Greek ambition, was a dangerous place for a small nation caught between loyalties. Antiochus III's son, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, inherited not his father's diplomacy, but his empire's instability. By 175 BCE, political tensions in Jerusalem had reached a breaking point. Rival high priests, Jason and Menelaus, vied for power, each promising the king greater tribute and deeper Hellenization in exchange for the position. Jason, urbane and fluent in Greek, went so far as to establish a gymnasium in Jerusalem itself, where young men, some even of priestly descent, trained in Greek fashion. This was not merely a cultural change. It was a public statement that Jerusalem was becoming a city like Antioch or Alexandria. For the traditionalists, this was betrayal. For Antiochus, it was an opportunity. He saw Judea not as a land with its own destiny, but as a rebellious province to be streamlined into the cultural mold of the empire. Desecration and despair. The crisis exploded in 167 BCE, whether provoked by a Jewish uprising or driven by his own zeal for control. Antiochus IV marched on Jerusalem. Soldiers stormed the temple, looting its treasures, the golden altar, the sacred vessels, the veil before the Holy of Holies. Then came the unthinkable. He dedicated the temple to Zeus Olympios. A pagan altar was erected upon the existing altar, and sacrifices of pigs, the very symbol of impurity in Jewish law, were offered in its courts. The scrolls of the Torah were seized and burned. Observance of the Sabbath, circumcision, and other covenantal practices were outlawed under penalty of death. Mothers who circumcised their children were executed, their infants killed before their eyes. In the streets, markets emptied, homes were shuttered. Priests who once sang psalms now hid in caves, whispering prayers into the dark. The city, once vibrant, lay under a suffocating silence. The spark of rebellion, the first open defiance, came not in Jerusalem, but in the rural hills of Modine. There, a priest named Mattathias was confronted by a royal official who demanded he offer a pagan sacrifice. When another Jew stepped forward to comply, Mattathias, in a burst of fury, struck him dead and killed the official as well. With his 5 sons, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan, Mattathias fled into the hills. Others, hearing of his defiance, joined him. The rebels fought not as regular soldiers, but as guerrillas, striking Seleucid patrols in sudden ambushes, melting back into the wilderness. When Mattathias died in 166 BCE, leadership passed to his 3rd son, Judas, soon to be called Maccabeus the Hammer. Judas Maccabeus, the Hammer of Judea. Judas was no king, no general trained in the courts of the great powers, but he was a man of iron will, his faith a weapon sharper than any sword. His small force, poorly armed, often fasting, clothed in patched tunics, faced professional armies clad in bronze and iron. Yet battle after battle, the Maccabees triumphed. At Emmaus, they routed a Seleucid force, capturing weapons and armor. At Beth Horon, they used the steep terrain to trap their enemies in a deadly funnel. Judas moved his fighters like shadows, striking where least expected, disappearing before the counterblow could land. The Seleucid generals underestimated them, dismissing them as zealots. But zealots with a cause can be deadlier than mercenaries with pay. The cleansing of the temple. In 164 BCE, after a string of victories, Judas marched on Jerusalem. The city's defenders fled. The temple, abandoned by its occupiers, stood defiled. The Maccabees entered in solemn procession. They tore down the pagan altar, rebuilt the sacred one, and crafted new vessels for worship. Oil for the temple lamp, the menorah, was found, enough for just one day. Yet, according to tradition, it burned for 8 days until new oil could be prepared. This miracle became the foundation of Hanukkah, the festival of lights, celebrated to this day. The cleansing was not the end of the war. Seleucid forces would return, and Judas himself would fall in battle in 160 B, but it was a moment of rebirth, a statement that faith could survive the flames. The Hasmonean dynasty, Judas's brothers, carried on the struggle. By 142 BCE, Simon Maccabeus secured an agreement with the weakened Seleucids, granting Judea full political independence. The Hasmonean dynasty, named after the family's ancestor Hasmon, was born. Under the Hasmoneans, Judea expanded its borders, minted its own coins, and restored the temple's prominence. But power changed them. Later, Hasmonean rulers would become entangled in internal strife, even inviting Rome into their disputes. A choice whose consequences would echo into the time of Herod and beyond. Still, for a brief generation, the dream was real. A Jewish state, free from foreign overlords, born not from diplomacy, but from the grit of farmers turned warriors who refused to let their covenant be erased. The Maccabean Revolt was more than a clash of arms. It was a war for the soul of a people. Hellenism was not merely an occupying culture. It was a rival worldview. Where the Torah proclaimed one God, Greek religion offered a pantheon. Where Jewish law bound a community in shared rituals, Greek culture prized the autonomy of the individual. The tension between assimilation and identity, between modernity and tradition, is not confined to the ancient world. The story of the Maccabees resonates because it speaks to the human struggle to balance adaptation with preservation, to live in the world without losing oneself to it. When the menorah's flames first flickered in the cleansed temple, their light fell not just on stone and gold, but on the faces of those who had risked everything to see it burn again. Outside, the world was still dangerous, the empire still restless. But for a moment, in the heart of Jerusalem, there was warmth against the cold, light against the dark, and the knowledge that some fires, once kindled, can never be extinguished.